Welcome, Beyond Midnight viewers, to a journey into the shadowed corners of history, where the gleaming facade of legend often crumbles under the weight of harsh truth. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our deep dives into the untold stories of the past. Tonight, we embark on an exploration that will challenge everything you thought you knew about one of history's most iconic figures, the knight. For centuries, our collective imagination has been captivated by the image of the noble knight in shining armor, a paragon of chivalry, courage, and honor, riding valiantly into battle to defend the innocent, rescue damsels in distress, and uphold justice. Tales of King Arthur and his Round Table, of Lancelot, Galahad, and Percival have painted a picture of an almost mythical existence, where bravery was rewarded with glory, and life was a grand tapestry of quests and tournaments. We envision them as figures of immense strength and unwavering moral fortitude, their lives a romantic ballet of jousts, courtly love, and heroic deeds. But what if I told you that this glittering image, so deeply ingrained in our cultural consciousness, is largely a carefully constructed illusion? What if the reality of knighthood was less about glory and more about grime, less about honor and more about agonizing pain, endless toil, and the constant specter of a brutal, ignominious end? Tonight, we will strip away the layers of myth and reveal the raw, often horrifying truth behind the armored persona. We will delve into the relentless training that began in childhood, the crushing weight of their iconic armor, the visceral horror of medieval warfare, the crippling financial burden, and the pervasive threat of disease and disfigurement that overshadowed every waking moment. This is not a story of valiant heroes effortlessly conquering foes. It is a narrative of ordinary men pushed to extraordinary limits, enduring unimaginable suffering, often for little reward beyond survival itself. We will uncover why, for the vast majority of those who bore the title, being a knight was not a path to glory, but a relentless, grueling odyssey of pain. The popular perception of a knight is often shaped by the romantic literature of the High Middle Ages, particularly the chivalric romances that emerged from the 12th century onwards. These narratives, often penned by poets and troubadours for noble patrons, idealized the knightly class, presenting them as the epitome of virtue and martial prowess. They spoke of a code of chivalry that encompassed bravery, loyalty, generosity, courtesy, and protection of the weak. In these tales, knights were frequently engaged in fantastical adventures, battling dragons, rescuing fair maidens, and participating in grand tournaments where skill and honor were paramount. This literary tradition, amplified over centuries through art, folklore, and modern media, has solidified a highly sanitized and often inaccurate view of what it truly meant to live and die as a knight. But the reality was far more stark, far more brutal, and infinitely less glamorous. The Middle Ages, particularly the period from the 10th to the 15th centuries when knighthood was at its zenith, was a time of endemic warfare, political instability, and widespread hardship. Life expectancy was low, hygiene was rudimentary, and violence was an ever-present fact of existence. In this world, the knight was first and foremost a professional warrior, an instrument of war for their lord, and their primary function was to fight, kill, and endure. Let us begin our descent into this reality by examining the very foundation of knighthood, the training. Becoming a knight was not a matter of simply donning armor and declaring oneself ready for battle. It was a lifelong commitment, a rigorous and often brutal apprenticeship that began in early childhood, shaping every aspect of a young man's physical and mental being. The journey typically commenced around the age of 7, when a young boy of noble birth, or at least from a landowning family, would be sent away from his home to serve as a page in the household of a lord, a baron, or even a higher-ranking knight. This was not a pleasant holiday. It was a deliberate and often harsh separation from the comforts of family, designed to instill discipline, obedience, and self-reliance from a tender age. The page's duties were varied and often mundane, serving as a personal attendant to the ladies of the castle, running errands, waiting at table, and learning basic courtly manners. But beneath this veneer of domestic service lay the true purpose of his presence, to begin his education in the martial arts and the code of chivalry. Pages were taught to ride horses, often bareback at first, developing balance and control. They learned rudimentary weapons skills, starting with wooden swords and blunted lances, practicing drills and mock combat. Physical conditioning was paramount. Running, jumping, wrestling, and enduring harsh weather were all part of the daily regimen, designed to build strength, endurance, and resilience. They were also instructed in the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic, though literacy levels varied greatly. More importantly, they received religious instruction, as piety was considered a cornerstone of the chivalric ideal, even if often ignored in practice. They learned the rules of heraldry, the intricacies of courtly etiquette, and the importance of loyalty to their lord. This period was not without its dangers. Injuries during training were common, and the young boys were often exposed to the harsh realities of castle life, including the frequent presence of armed men, the sounds of weapon practice, and the occasional sight of prisoners or casualties of war. Around the age of 14, if he had proven himself capable and dedicated, the page would advance to the rank of squire. This marked a significant escalation in his training and responsibilities. The squire became a personal assistant to a specific knight, often the lord of the castle himself, or a knight in his retinue. This was an intensely practical apprenticeship, where the squire learned by direct observation and participation. His duties were far more demanding and directly related to warfare. He was responsible for maintaining his knight's armor, ensuring it was clean, polished, and free of rust, a monumental task given the materials and conditions of the time. He would care for the knight's horses, grooming them, feeding them, and ensuring they were always ready for travel or battle. He would carry the knight's shield and weapons, often following him into battle, standing at a safe distance but ready to provide a fresh weapon, a drink of water, or assist if the knight was unhorsed or wounded. The physical training intensified dramatically for a squire. He would spend hours practicing with real, albeit blunted, weapons, honing his swordsmanship, lance skills, and proficiency with other armaments like maces and axes. He would engage in more realistic mock combat, often against other squires or even experienced men-at-arms, where blows were exchanged, and injuries, though not intended to be fatal, were a common occurrence. He learned to wear and move in armor, gradually acclimating to its weight and restrictions. He practiced jousting, initially with blunted lances and at slower speeds, but progressively building up to full contact practice, which was incredibly dangerous. The goal was to develop the strength, agility, and reflexes necessary to survive on the battlefield. Beyond the physical, the squire's education extended to the practicalities of war. He learned about strategy, tactics, siege warfare, and the logistics of campaigning. He observed his knight in council, listened to discussions of battle plans, and gained an understanding of the political landscape. He was expected to develop courage, discipline, and an unshakable sense of loyalty. The squire's life was one of constant readiness, often sleeping in his armor or close to his weapons, prepared to answer the call of his knight at any moment. This period could last anywhere from 7 to 10 years, sometimes even longer, depending on the individual's progress, the availability of a suitable opportunity, and the knight's financial circumstances. Finally, typically in his late teens or early 20s, if he had successfully completed his rigorous training and proven his worth on the battlefield or in service, the squire would be deemed ready for the ultimate step, dubbing. This ceremony, often simple but sometimes elaborate, involved the squire kneeling before his lord, who would tap him on the shoulder with a sword, uttering words like, "Be a knight, brave and loyal." This moment, romanticized in countless stories, was the culmination of years of hardship, pain, and dedication. But it was not an end to the suffering. It was merely the beginning of a new, even more demanding phase of life. Consider the sheer physical toll this training took. From the age of 7, these boys were subjected to a life of constant physical exertion, exposure, and the risk of injury. Bones were broken, muscles were strained, cuts and bruises were daily occurrences. The diet, while generally better than that of the peasantry, was often monotonous and lacked proper nutrition, especially during campaigns. Diseases like dysentery, smallpox, and various fevers were rampant, and a child's immune system was constantly under siege. Many would not survive the training period, succumbing to illness or injury before ever earning their spurs. Those who did emerge were hardened, disciplined, and physically formidable, but they carried the scars, both visible and invisible, of their arduous upbringing. Their bodies were already accustomed to pain, a necessary preparation for the agony that awaited them on the battlefield. Now let us turn our attention to the iconic symbol of the knight, the armor. The image of a knight in shining armor is deeply ingrained in our minds, suggesting invulnerability and grandeur. Yet this very symbol of power was, in reality, a source of immense discomfort, restriction, and danger. Far from being a gleaming, lightweight second skin, medieval plate armor was a heavy, cumbersome, and incredibly hot prison of steel. Early forms of knightly protection, such as mail chainmail, were lighter but offered less protection against crushing blows. By the 14th and 15th centuries, full plate armor, meticulously crafted from interlocking steel plates, became the standard. While it offered superior protection against cuts and thrusts, its sheer weight and bulk presented a formidable challenge to the wearer. A full suit of plate armor, complete with helmet, gauntlets, greaves, and breastplate, could weigh anywhere from 50 to 70 pounds, approximately 23 to 32 kilograms. This weight was distributed across the body, but it was still a significant burden, especially when combined with the weight of weapons and equipment. Imagine attempting to move, fight, or even simply stand for extended periods while carrying an additional 50-70 pounds of rigid steel. Every movement required immense effort. Walking, running, or climbing stairs became an exhausting ordeal. Getting on and off a horse, particularly if unassisted, was a feat of strength and agility. If a knight was unhorsed in battle, falling to the ground could be incredibly dangerous. The weight of the armor made it difficult, if not impossible, to quickly regain one's feet, leaving the knight vulnerable to enemy attack or even trampling by horses. Many knights who fell in battle were not killed by a direct blow, but by being suffocated or crushed under their own armor in the chaos, or simply unable to defend themselves once prone. Beyond the weight, the armor presented severe limitations on mobility and sensory perception. While modern reconstructions have shown that well-made plate armor allowed for a surprising degree of flexibility, it was still far from natural movement. The joints were carefully articulated, but they could still pinch, rub, and restrict the wearer. The helmet, particularly the closed-faced great helm or later visored bassinet, severely limited peripheral vision and hearing. A knight's world inside his helmet was a narrow tunnel, his senses muffled, making it difficult to perceive threats from the side or behind, or to hear commands amidst the din of battle. This sensory deprivation contributed to the disorienting and terrifying experience of combat. Perhaps the most significant and constant discomfort of wearing armor was the heat. Encased in layers of steel, often over padded gambesons and woolen undergarments, a knight would quickly overheat, especially under the sun or during strenuous activity. The metal absorbed and retained heat, turning the armor into a personal oven. Dehydration and heat stroke were constant threats, capable of incapacitating a knight long before any enemy blow. Perspiration would soak the padding, leading to chafing, skin irritation, and the pervasive stench of sweat and grime. Maintaining this complex piece of equipment was another endless chore and a significant expense. Plate armor, made of steel, was highly susceptible to rust, especially in damp climates or after exposure to rain and sweat. Each piece had to be meticulously cleaned, polished, and oiled after every use, a task usually performed by the squire but overseen by the knight. Dents, cracks, and broken straps were common occurrences, requiring skilled armorers to repair them. These repairs were costly and time-consuming, meaning a knight's armor was rarely in pristine condition, often bearing the marks of past battles and the wear and tear of constant use. A knight often owned multiple sets of armor, or at least spare parts, to ensure he was always ready for service, further adding to the financial strain. The process of simply getting into and out of armor was a lengthy and often undignified affair, requiring the assistance of squires or servants. It was not something a knight could do quickly or alone. This reliance on others underscored the lack of autonomy and constant need for support that defined much of a knight's life. He was a cog in a larger machine, utterly dependent on his retinue for his very readiness. So the shining armor, far from being a symbol of effortless power, was a heavy, hot, restrictive, and high-maintenance burden. It was a necessary evil, a protective shell that enabled survival in a brutal world, but one that extracted a constant toll in terms of comfort, mobility, and sheer physical endurance. It was a constant reminder that the life of a knight was defined by struggle, not by ease. Now let us consider the tools of their trade, the weapons. If the armor was a burden, the weapons were instruments of brutal efficiency, designed not for elegant duels, but for mass slaughter and incapacitation. The romantic image of the knight with a perfectly balanced, gleaming sword is often far removed from the reality of medieval combat. The sword, while iconic, was not always the primary weapon, and certainly not the only one. Swords of the medieval period were heavy, often weighing between 2.5 to 4 pounds, 1.1 to 1.8 kg for a single-handed sword, and considerably more for a two-handed greatsword. While this might not sound like much, imagine wielding such a weight for minutes or even hours in the midst of a chaotic battle while wearing heavy armor and fighting for your life. Swords were designed for cutting, thrusting, and hacking, and required immense strength, stamina, and precise technique to be effective against armored opponents. A single blow might not be enough to penetrate plate armor, requiring repeated strikes to weak points or vulnerable joints. The sheer physical exertion of sword fighting was immense, quickly leading to exhaustion. The lance was perhaps the most devastating weapon in a knight's arsenal during a cavalry charge. This long, heavy wooden pole, often 10 to 14 feet, 3 to 4.3 meters in length, tipped with a sharp steel head, was wielded by a charging knight on horseback. The impact of a fully armored knight, riding a powerful warhorse at full gallop, striking an enemy with a lance was catastrophic. It could shatter bones, pierce armor, and dismount even the most heavily armored opponent. However, the lance was typically a single-use weapon. Once the initial charge was made, the lance would often splinter, break, or be discarded, leaving the knight to draw his sword or another secondary weapon. The skill required to wield a lance effectively was immense, demanding perfect balance, timing, and control over both horse and weapon. A poorly aimed strike could throw the knight from his horse, or simply glance off the target, leaving him vulnerable. But knights also carried a variety of other, often more brutal, weapons designed specifically to counter armor. Maces, war hammers, and battle axes were common. These weapons were not designed to cut or thrust, but to deliver crushing blows that could dent, deform, and transfer immense kinetic energy through armor, causing blunt force trauma, broken bones, and internal injuries even if the armor was not pierced. A mace with its flanged or spiked head could pulp flesh and bone. A war hammer with its blunt head and piercing spike could punch through armor or crack helmets. Battle axes, with their heavy heads and sharp edges, could cleave through shields and limbs. These were not weapons of elegance. They were instruments of pure, unadulterated destruction, designed to inflict maximum pain and damage in close-quarters combat. The nature of medieval combat itself was horrifyingly visceral. Battles were not grand, choreographed duels, but chaotic, terrifying melees. The air would be thick with the screams of men, the neighing of horses, the clang of steel on steel, and the sickening thud of weapons striking flesh and bone. the ground would quickly become a slippery morass of mud, blood, and dismembered bodies. Knights, despite their armor, were not immune to the horrors. They were at the heart of the maelstrom, constantly surrounded by danger, fighting for their lives against multiple opponents, often in cramped and suffocating conditions. The risk of injury was omnipresent. While plate armor offered excellent protection against direct cuts and thrusts, it was not impenetrable. Gaps at the joints, visor slits, and areas where plates overlapped were vulnerable. Even if the armor held, the sheer force of blows could cause severe concussions, broken bones, and internal bleeding. A knight might survive a battle only to be permanently maimed, losing a limb, an eye, or suffering debilitating injuries that would cripple him for life. Infections from wounds were rampant, as medieval medicine was rudimentary at best. A simple cut could quickly turn gangrenous, leading to amputation or a slow, agonizing death. The psychological toll was equally immense. Witnessing such brutality, inflicting it, and constantly living with the threat of one's own demise or disfigurement would inevitably lead to severe trauma, what we today might recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Beyond the direct combat, knights faced dangers from projectiles. While they were the heavy cavalry, vulnerable to arrows and crossbow bolts, their armor offered significant protection. However, a lucky shot through a visor slit or a joint could still be fatal. More often, the real danger came from falling, being unhorsed, or being surrounded by infantry who could exploit their limited mobility on foot. The very concept of battle was a test of endurance as much as skill. A knight had to maintain his composure, his strength, and his will to fight for extended periods, often under extreme duress, heat, and exhaustion. The adrenaline would surge, then crash, leaving him drained and vulnerable. The smell of blood, sweat, and fear, the constant noise, the sight of friends and foes falling around him, all contributed to an experience that was far from glorious. It was a nightmare. And what of the aftermath? Victory was not always glorious. It often meant looting, pillaging, and the gruesome task of dispatching the wounded or rounding up prisoners for ransom. Defeat meant capture, potential torture, execution, or the ignominy of being held for ransom, which brings us to another significant source of pain for the knight, the economic burden. The life of a knight, far from being one of inherent wealth and leisure, was often a precarious existence, fraught with immense financial strain. The popular image of a wealthy lord with vast estates is true for some high-ranking nobles who were also knights, but for the vast majority of knights, particularly those of lesser nobility or gentry, their financial reality was one of constant struggle and often crippling debt. The very tools of their trade were prohibitively expensive. A powerful warhorse known as a destrier was an essential part of a knight's identity and fighting capability. These horses were specially bred for strength, courage, and stamina and were incredibly valuable. A single destrier could cost the equivalent of a small village or several years of a peasant's income. And a knight needed more than one. He needed a palfrey for travel, a pack horse for equipment, and often a spare destrier. Maintaining these animals, feeding them, stabling them, shoeing them, and providing veterinary care was an ongoing, significant expense. Horses were susceptible to disease, injury, and death in battle, meaning a knight could lose a substantial portion of his wealth in a single engagement. Then there was the armor itself. As we discussed, a full suit of plate armor was a masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship, custom-made to fit the individual knight. It required skilled armorers, expensive materials, and countless hours of labor. Such a suit could cost as much as a small farm, and this was not a one-time purchase. Armor needed constant maintenance, repairs, and sometimes replacement parts. A knight might also need different sets for different purposes, such as lighter armor for travel or more elaborate armor for tournaments and ceremonies. Weapons too, while perhaps less costly than armor or horses, added to the burden. Swords, lances, maces, and daggers all had to be acquired, maintained, and replaced if lost or damaged. Beyond their personal equipment, a knight was expected to maintain a retinue. This often included at least one squire, possibly a page, and several men-at-arms or archers who served him directly. These individuals needed to be fed, housed, and paid, even if their pay was often in kind or through service. Providing for this retinue was a significant ongoing expense, especially during campaigns or when away from their estates. If a knight owned land or a small castle, the costs only multiplied. Castles required constant maintenance, repairs, and garrisoning. Estates needed to be managed, and taxes or feudal dues paid to their own lord. Agricultural yields could be unpredictable, subject to weather, disease, or raiding, further impacting a knight's income. Many knights, especially those lower down the feudal ladder, held only small plots of land, or received their income directly from their lord in exchange for service, leaving them with little surplus wealth. The tournament, often seen as a glorious spectacle, was another financial drain. Participating in tournaments required significant investment in specialized armor, lances, and horses. There were entry fees, travel expenses, and the cost of lodging and feeding one's retinue. While winning a tournament could bring valuable prizes, including armor, horses, or ransom money from defeated opponents, the risk of losing was equally high. An injury sustained in a tournament could end a knight's career, leaving him unable to earn his living and potentially bankrupting his family. Losing a horse or damaging expensive armor in a joust could set a knight back financially for years. But perhaps the most terrifying financial burden, and one that cast a long shadow over every battle, was the risk of ransom. In medieval warfare, it was often more profitable to capture an enemy knight than to kill him. A captured knight, especially one of noble birth, could be held for ransom, with his family expected to pay a hefty sum for his release. The amount demanded could be astronomical, often equivalent to several years of a family's income or the value of their entire estate. If the family could not raise the ransom, the knight faced a grim fate: perpetual imprisonment, forced servitude, or even execution. The pressure on a knight's family to secure his release was immense, often leading to the sale of lands, mortgaging of property, or plunging the family into generations of debt. This constant threat of financial ruin hung over every engagement, adding a layer of psychological stress to the already terrifying prospect of battle. Many knights were not wealthy landowners. They were often younger sons who had not inherited land, or landless adventurers who sought their fortune through military service. For these men, life was a constant struggle for survival, seeking employment with a lord, participating in campaigns for plunder, or trying to win enough in tournaments to sustain themselves. Their lives were a cycle of feast and famine, periods of relative comfort followed by months of grinding poverty. The romantic notion of the knight as a figure of inherent wealth and comfort is largely a myth. For many, it was a life of constant financial anxiety. Beyond the physical and financial pain, there was the pervasive threat of disease and the constant struggle with hygiene. The medieval world was a microbial nightmare, and knights, despite their elevated status, were far from immune. In fact, their lifestyle, characterized by prolonged campaigns, crowded conditions, and often poor sanitation, made them particularly vulnerable. Poor hygiene was a fact of life for almost everyone in the Middle Ages, but for a knight on campaign, it reached extreme levels. Bathing was infrequent, often limited to what could be managed in a cold stream or a shared tub if available. Clothes were rarely washed, leading to skin irritation, lice, and fleas. The constant wearing of heavy, padded armor, soaked with sweat, created a breeding ground for bacteria and fungi, leading to chronic skin conditions and infections. Food and water quality were major concerns. On campaign, food was often meager, monotonous, and poorly preserved, consisting of hardtack, dried meat, and whatever could be scavenged or plundered. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rare, leading to vitamin deficiencies and diseases like scurvy. Water sources were often contaminated by human and animal waste, leading to widespread outbreaks of dysentery, a debilitating and often fatal disease characterized by severe diarrhea and dehydration. Armies on the march were frequently decimated by dysentery, sometimes losing more men to illness than to enemy action. Wounds sustained in battle, even minor ones, posed an enormous risk. Without modern antibiotics or antiseptic practices, any break in the skin could quickly become infected. A simple cut could fester, leading to cellulitis, abscesses, or most terrifyingly, gangrene. Gangrene, a bacterial infection that causes tissue death, would often necessitate amputation, a brutal procedure performed without anesthesia and with a high risk of shock and further infection. Even if a knight survived an amputation, he would be permanently disfigured and crippled, often unable to continue his military career. Beyond battlefield injuries, knights were susceptible to all the common diseases of the era. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, spared no one, including the nobility and knights. Other infectious diseases like smallpox, measles, and various fevers were constant threats. Life expectancy, even for the privileged, was significantly shorter than today, and few knights reached old age without bearing the marks of chronic pain, old injuries, and the lingering effects of past illnesses. The psychological toll of living in such conditions, constantly exposed to illness and the threat of agonizing death from infection, cannot be overstated. Every scratch, every fever, every bout of stomach sickness carried the potential for a swift and painful end. The knight's body, his primary tool, was constantly under siege from within and without. This constant vulnerability to disease and the lack of effective medical treatment added another layer of profound pain and anxiety to the knight's already arduous existence. It meant that even if he survived the sword, the lance, and the mace, he might still succumb to an invisible enemy, slowly wasting away in a camp or a castle bed, far from the glorious death in battle that so many romantic tales glorified. The reality was often a slow, agonizing decline, punctuated by pain and despair, a stark contrast to the noble image. The very concept of chivalry, so central to the knightly ideal, often served as another source of internal conflict and external pressure, adding to the pain rather than alleviating it. The chivalric code, with its emphasis on honor, loyalty, courage, courtesy, and protection of the weak, was largely an aspirational ideal rather than a universally observed set of rules. While some knights undoubtedly strove to live by its tenets, the brutal realities of warfare, political intrigue, and personal ambition often led to its convenient disregard. Knights were expected to be pious, yet they frequently engaged in acts of extreme violence, plunder, and cruelty, often against civilians. They were supposed to protect the weak, yet they were instruments of feudal lords who regularly waged war on their neighbors, leading to the devastation of peasant lands and lives. They were expected to be courteous, yet the social hierarchy was rigid, and their interactions with those of lower status were often dismissive or brutal. The internal struggle between the idealized code and the pragmatic necessities of survival and service must have been a constant source of cognitive dissonance for many. The pressure to uphold one's honor and reputation was immense. A knight's standing depended heavily on his perceived bravery, martial skill, and adherence to the unwritten rules of his class. Any perceived slight, cowardice, or dishonorable act could lead to social ostracization, loss of patronage, or even challenges to duels. This constant need to prove oneself, to maintain a facade of unwavering courage and virtue, added a significant psychological burden. The fear of shame or dishonor could be as potent as the fear of death, driving knights to take unnecessary risks or endure unbearable pain rather than admit weakness. Feudal obligations also imposed a heavy burden. A knight was bound by an oath of fealty to his lord, promising military service, counsel, and loyalty in exchange for land or other forms of patronage. This meant a knight was not always free to choose his battles or his allegiances. He might be compelled to fight against former friends, against his own moral convictions, or in campaigns that offered little personal gain. Failure to fulfill these obligations could result in forfeiture of land, title, or even execution. The life of a knight was not one of free agency, but of strict adherence to a complex web of duties and allegiances, often putting him in morally compromising situations. Marriage for a knight was rarely a matter of romantic love. It was almost exclusively a strategic alliance, arranged by families to consolidate power, acquire land, or secure political influence. Knights were expected to marry women of suitable social standing, and their personal preferences were secondary to dynastic considerations. This often meant a life devoid of emotional intimacy in their primary relationship, adding another layer of personal dissatisfaction to an already demanding existence. The concept of courtly love, so prevalent in chivalric romances, was an idealized and often platonic relationship between a knight and a married noblewoman, a fantasy that rarely translated into the realities of marriage or daily life. The options for a knight who wished to escape the military life were extremely limited. For those who survived long enough to retire, or who were too injured to fight, were extremely limited. For those who survived long enough to retire, or who were too injured to fight, their options were often bleak, adding yet another layer of potential suffering to their already arduous lives. Unlike modern professions with pensions or retirement plans, the medieval world offered no such safety net for a knight whose fighting days were over. If a knight was fortunate enough to have inherited or acquired significant land, he might retreat to his estates, overseeing his tenants and managing his household. But even then, his body would likely be a testament to years of abuse, chronic pain from old wounds, arthritis from constant exposure and exertion, a limp from a broken leg that never quite healed, scars that spoke of countless close calls. His mind, too, would bear the indelible marks of battle, the haunting memories of fallen comrades, the horrors he witnessed, and the violence he inflicted. The quiet solitude of a castle, far from being a peaceful respite, could become a prison of memory, where the screams of the battlefield echoed in the silence. For the majority of knights, however, who held less land or were landless, retirement was not a comfortable retreat. An injured knight who could no longer wield a sword or ride a horse effectively became a burden. His lord might provide a small pension or a place to live out his days out of loyalty or obligation, but this was not guaranteed. Many would face a slow decline into poverty, dependent on the charity of others, or forced into less honorable, often humiliating, forms of employment. Some might become castle guards, their once proud armor gathering dust, their bodies aching with every shift. Others might descend into banditry or mercenary work, driven by desperation, further eroding any remaining sense of honor or purpose. The psychological impact of losing one's identity as a warrior, of being unable to perform the very function for which one had been trained since childhood, must have been devastating. A knight without a purpose was a man adrift in a world that had no place for him. A common alternative for some, particularly those who sought spiritual solace or a structured existence away from the brutality of the secular world, was to enter a monastery. Monastic life, while offering a refuge from direct physical combat, was by no means an easy escape. It involved a life of strict discipline, arduous manual labor, fasting, and constant prayer. The transition from a life of violence and worldly pursuits to one of quiet contemplation and spiritual devotion would have been profoundly challenging. While the physical dangers of the battlefield were gone, the internal battles, the struggle with past sins, and the lingering psychological trauma would have remained. For many, the monastery was less a choice than a last resort, a place to seek forgiveness or simply to die with some semblance of peace, away from the chaos that had defined their lives. The life of a knight was, in essence, a life sentence of pain, beginning in childhood and often ending prematurely and brutally. Even if a knight survived to old age, his body would be a map of his past suffering. The constant jarring of riding a warhorse in heavy armor would lead to chronic back pain and joint issues. The repeated blows to the head, even if the helmet protected against penetration, would cause concussions and neurological damage, leading to headaches, dizziness, and cognitive decline. The sheer physical exertion of fighting, day in and day out, would wear down muscles and bones, leading to early onset arthritis and debilitating stiffness. Injuries that today would be easily treated, like a broken bone or a deep cut, could lead to permanent disfigurement, chronic pain, or even death from infection. The medieval knight lived with a body that was constantly under assault, rarely given the opportunity to fully heal or recover. Moreover, the psychological scars were profound and often ignored in historical accounts. The constant exposure to violence, death, and suffering, the need to kill and inflict pain, the loss of comrades, and the ever-present threat of one's own demise would inevitably lead to severe mental health issues. What we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, would have been rampant among medieval knights. They would have experienced nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and difficulty forming meaningful relationships. The desensitization required to survive such brutality would have come at a steep cost to their humanity. They were trained to be instruments of war, and that training often stripped away their capacity for empathy and normal emotional responses, leaving them isolated and tormented. The concept of moral injury, where one's moral compass is violated by acts committed or witnessed in war, would also have been a heavy burden for many, especially those who tried to adhere to the chivalric ideal. The cumulative toll of these hardships is almost unimaginable to the modern mind. From the tender age of 7, a knight's life was a relentless cycle of physical exertion, danger, financial anxiety, and psychological trauma. He was born into a system that demanded his suffering, trained him to endure it, and then threw him into a world where it was omnipresent. The glory was a fleeting moment, a brief cheer, a line in a chronicle, often overshadowed by the years of grinding, anonymous pain that preceded and followed it. The image of the shining knight, so often invoked, was less a reflection of reality and more a carefully constructed facade, designed to serve the interests of the powerful. Let us consider the purpose of this myth of glory, who benefited from this romanticized image of knighthood, primarily the feudal lords, kings, and the church. The chivalric ideal, propagated by court poets, chroniclers, and religious institutions, served as a powerful tool for social control and legitimization. By presenting knights as noble, virtuous, and divinely sanctioned warriors, the ruling class could inspire loyalty, justify their own power, and encourage men to undertake the brutal and dangerous profession of arms. The tales of heroic deeds and unwavering honor provided a moral framework, however flimsy, for a society built on violence and hierarchy. It encouraged young men of noble birth to embrace their martial destiny, to endure the harsh training, and to risk their lives in service to their lord and faith. The promise of glory, renown, and a place in the afterlife was a powerful motivator, masking the squalid reality of constant pain, financial destitution, and a high probability of a gruesome death. It was, in essence, propaganda. It glorified sacrifice, not for the individual's benefit, but for the stability and power of the feudal system. The church, too, played a significant role in shaping the chivalric ideal, attempting to channel the inherent violence of the knightly class towards righteous causes, such as the Crusades. By sanctifying the warrior, by offering spiritual rewards for fighting infidels, the church sought to control and direct the destructive energies of knighthood, further legitimizing their existence as instruments of God's will. This religious overlay, while offering spiritual comfort to some, also imposed immense pressure on knights to conform to a moral standard that was often impossible to maintain in the chaos of war. The reality, however, was that knights were, first and foremost, pragmatic instruments of power. Their loyalty was often bought with land or promises, not simply with ideals. Their actions were dictated by political necessity, territorial disputes, and the demands of their lords, not always by a pure adherence to chivalry. They were often ruthless, opportunistic, and brutal, engaging in acts of plunder, rape, and indiscriminate violence against civilians, which stood in stark contrast to the romanticized code they supposedly upheld. The gap between the ideal and the lived reality was vast, a source of hypocrisy and moral compromise that added another layer of unseen pain to the knight's existence. The enduring power of the knightly myth speaks volumes about humanity's desire for heroes, for figures who embody courage and virtue in a chaotic world. But to truly understand history, we must look beyond the polished facade and delve into the gritty, painful truth. The medieval knight was not a figure of effortless glory, but a product of an incredibly harsh and unforgiving age. His life was a testament to human endurance, not because of the glory he achieved, but because of the immense suffering he was forced to bear. From the moment a young boy was sent away to begin his training, his life became a relentless gauntlet of physical hardship, psychological pressure, and constant danger. He endured years of brutal conditioning, learned to wield devastating weapons, and wore armor that was both his shield and his prison. He faced the visceral horrors of medieval battle, where death and disfigurement were ever-present companions. He lived with the constant specter of financial ruin, the crushing burden of debt, and the ever-present threat of capture and ransom. He battled unseen enemies in the form of disease and infection, often succumbing to ailments that would be minor inconveniences today. And throughout it all, he carried the immense psychological burden of trauma, moral compromise, and the relentless pressure to uphold an often unattainable ideal of honor. The glory of knighthood was a construct, a narrative spun by poets and patrons to serve their own ends. For the vast majority of those who lived and died as knights, their lives were defined by pain, the pain of a body constantly broken and rebroken, the pain of a mind haunted by violence, the pain of a spirit constrained by duty and circumstance, and the pain of a life lived on the knife edge of survival. They were not invincible heroes. They were human beings, pushed to the absolute limits of endurance, their lives a stark reminder of the brutal realities of the medieval world. So the next time you see the image of a knight in shining armor, remember the truth beneath the gleam. Remember the child sent away from home, the squire enduring endless drills, the warrior suffocating in his steel shell, the man battling disease in a filthy camp, and the veteran limping through a life of chronic pain. Remember that the true heroism of the knight was not in the fleeting moments of triumph, but in the sheer, unyielding endurance of a life that was, overwhelmingly, more pain than glory. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the often unseen realities of history. If this deep dive into the true cost of knighthood resonated with you, please leave a comment below, share your thoughts, and tell us what other historical myths you'd like us to deconstruct. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Beyond Midnight for more explorations into the shadows of the past. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep seeking the truth beyond the legends.